We need more abundant, cheaper, more secure electricity, and let's try to make it clean while we're at it.
If you could just share maybe one or two climate myths or truths that maybe are not part of the mainstream discussion right now, what are some of those myths or truths that people should be a little bit more aware of?
We should try to reduce our vulnerability, increase our resilience.
Now they talk about how many gigawatts of energy it's going to take to manage those terabytes and petabytes of data.
The development in Africa and other places has been all but stalled for decades now because of the climate change agenda.
They want reliability and affordability. Clean is great, but not at the expense of those two pillars. For all of you joining us today for this episode of the Watt and Why podcast, we have a great guest. Really excited to get into some of the interesting discussion with her. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest. Today's guest is Judith Curry, PhD, who's president and co-founder of the Climate Forecast Applications Network. Dr. Curry graduated cum laude from Northern Illinois University with a BS in geography, and she also earned her geophysical sciences PhD from the University of Chicago. She is professor emeritus at Georgia Tech, among numerous other academic postings, and she has testified multiple times before Congress. She also has many publications to her credit, including the recently published Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. Judith also is one of 5 co-authors of the 2025 Department of Energy Climate Assessment Report. So, Judith, thank you so much for joining the Watt and Why podcast today. We're looking forward to diving into this with you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Great. So we've done a little prep in the run-up to this, and I did want to just start with one of the things that was one of the more recent news-making things that you did, which was being one of those 5 co-authors on that Department of Energy report. So are there a few key things that you would want to share with utility leaders that, in your opinion, they should be looking at, thinking about, and acting on to ensure their utility can continue to execute on their mission, which, by the way, historically has always been to provide portable, safe, reliable energy. I think in the last few years, of course, we've added sustainability to that, which has added an interesting dynamic to how the industry is shaping. So what are some things from that report that maybe if you were sitting across the table from a utility C-level executive, you'd want to share with them and say, here's the things you really need to know and act on?
Well, the report wasn't really about, policy recommendations or anything like that. It was really a critical evaluation of, the scientific underpinnings for, the climate change issue. And basically the main message is that, there's no catastrophe in the making. In fact, there are some substantial benefits from increasing CO2 and warmer temperatures that, frequently get swept under the rug, completely ignored. So this idea of some sort of existential threat or catastrophe is just really a fairy tale. In our report, we went through the observation. It was heavily data centric. We focused on, the observations and going back, to 1900 or even, the 1800s where data is available just to show you what the natural variability is. And, the kinds of horrible extreme weather events that we saw in the first half of the 20th century and even the 19th century. So there's nothing unusual about what is happening. We talk about the slow creep of sea level rise, which is a slow creep, and there's no reason to think that it's going to get a whole lot worse over the course of the 21st century. So we just really provide a more realistic assessment of what is going on. And, the weakest part of the whole argument is that warming is dangerous. And, it's just a hard case to make that warming is dangerous. So when we talk about the economics and, basically, the biggest issue, in my opinion, is that we have oversimplified both the problem and its solution. The issue, we have the slow creep of sea level rise, and we are vulnerable to extreme weather events. So we should try to reduce our vulnerability, increase our resilience. And a key part of that is making sure that we have adequate electricity, inexpensive, abundant electricity. That's a key part of our ability to defend ourselves from whatever, with technologies or emergency management or whatever to keep ourselves safe from whatever Mother Nature might throw at us. So, abundant, inexpensive electricity is key. And the other thing we talk about, there's no justification for the urgency of, the net zero targets. I mean, there are many different arguments that you can make that we should, be undergoing some sort of a transition over the 21st century. With our electric utilities, of course, we need, more abundant, cheaper, more secure electricity, and let's try to make it clean while we're at it. But with the net zero target and the urgency of 2030 and 2050, people said, oh my gosh, this is so urgent. We don't have time to do anything other than wind and solar, which is really, fairly simple to install. And this has messed up the grid in many locations where they've tried to add too much. I mean, the recent example in Spain is a case in point where they're having, serious problems because they've incorporated too much wind and solar without paying attention to all the problems that it causes on the grid. And this is really more in my book rather than in the DOE report, my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. But the whole issue of land use and resource use for wind and solar is just, fairly prohibitive in terms of having this make any kind of sense, especially for Texas, where the data centers are exploding. And the estimate that they're going to need an order of magnitude more electricity, on a time scale of a few decades. Where is that going to come from? Well, most likely it's going to come from gas and nuclear, to the extent that we can rapidly build some more nuclear power plants. But there's no way that wind and solar can support that kind of rapid increase in electricity demand. So, we just need to focus more on energy abundance. And, we need to, step back and, rethink, what should the 21st century energy infrastructure look like? Let's give ourselves, 70, 80 years to, build this out. But let's make it something really amazing that is then scalable. And there's just no way this is wind and solar if for no other reason. Forget about all the grid and the technological issues. I mean, the land use is prohibitive. I think there's some good upside for rooftop solar. I mean, or, using the structures that we already have and trying to make, good use of that. And there's some imaginative ways of using solar panels on farmlands to help crops and help grazing and whatever. And I think those need to be explored a little bit more. But, trying to, these huge solar farms and wind farms, I mean, this is not the way we should be using our land. And there's just not enough land for the order of magnitude scale up that people are talking about. So, we just need to step back, get rid of the urgencies, and really figure out, with all the trial and error, learning by doing, and, all of this kind of, new technology development, let's take 7 decades to figure this out, plan, develop, implement, rather than trying to think we're going to do this in 10 years. So, I mean, that's sort of my main perspective on all this.
Yeah, I was going to say that's great. There's a lot there. And to my question, if you were sitting across the table from a utility executive, he or she would be making a lot of notes, just like I was, because there was a lot there. A few thoughts just to come back to some of the things you said. Me personally, up until about a year ago, I always said I'm an all of the above energy kind of guy. Let's just all the above. Let's have that energy mix. But I have to admit, I borrowed this from someone. I'm now more of a best of the above guy, because I think some of the things just don't fit the cost benefit analysis that needs to be done, which, by the way, for anything that's been this big in the history of industry, we've seen almost nothing in the way of a cost benefit analysis in the mainstream press, in the mainstream things that you read about battling climate change. It's always just the catastrophic possibilities and never anything about the other side of that ledger. Another thing that you mentioned there was about data centers. An observation about that is I've worked in technology and data for 35 years. Up until about a year or so ago, whenever there was any sort of technology project, and it was especially when there's data involved, it's this many terabytes of data. People would get excited about terabytes and petabytes of data, just talk about how big their project was. No more. Now they talk about how many gigawatts of energy it's going to take to manage those terabytes and petabytes of data. So I think there's been a wake-up call for sure. Now, also, you mentioned nuclear, particularly as it relates to the data center challenge. And obviously, nuclear has a history of success on several fronts. You know, certain European countries, over 50% of their power is generated from nuclear. Our country has a 70-year history of modular nuclear. It's called the nuclear navy, that hopefully there's going to be some sort of skill transfer there and technology transfer. When you mention nuclear, are you looking at some of the traditional big, 800,000 megawatt plants, like some of the ones we have out here in Diablo Canyon or Palisade in Michigan that's just been restarted? Or are you thinking more about the small modular reactors that certainly have a lot of promise? And by the way, TVA has just signed on and committed to 6 gigawatts of SMRs. So where are you landing on the nuclear question as part of this energy mix?
Well, for nuclear, I'm all of the above. I mean, it makes no sense to be shutting down existing nuclear power plants. The ones that we've shut down should be restarted. And we should, take advantage of the infrastructure we have. The Generation 4 technology is just so crazy exciting. There's so many, new ideas and new technologies that are coming out. I think anything that we can do to minimize these cross-continental transmission lines, I mean, that this doesn't make sense. It makes the grid vulnerable. I mean, it's a land use thing that we don't need. So, I mean, I live in Nevada. If you saw the movie Nomadland, we're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, 85% of the state is just nothing, but you see electric power lines across the whole state. I mean, even though there's nothing there. So, I mean, if there is something there, we should be able to have, the small or medium size, modular reactors and, minimize the need for these complicated transmission lines and systems that are actually vulnerable in many ways. So I think, nuclear affords tremendous opportunity, but the first step is to hang on to what we have and reactivate the ones we've shut down. I mean, this just makes absolutely no sense. The weird thing is that the climate advocates, the green activists and whatever, they seem to hate nuclear worse than fossil fuels. Okay, so, they're more adamant, about that. But I mean, in this transition period, we need to hang on to what we have, including the coal burners. I mean, these are very important particularly for, they're dirty, but use them for peak burners, and they play a critical role, particularly in cold air outbreaks. So, we need to hang on to what we have. There's an old Chinese proverb, is like, don't break it before you fix it, which means like, before we start kneecapping fossil fuels, we need to have an alternative energy infrastructure in place, which we don't. But that seems to be the way China is approaching it. They're installing all this wind and solar. They're not using it. It's hard to integrate into the grid, but they are installing it. But they're also keeping, their coal burners and even building more because, they know they need it for now.
Not only are they keeping it and building more, they're building it at between China and India. I think the number is 400 megawatts of coal coming online every month, and no sign of slowing down. And if I remember correctly, as part of the which meeting was it Tokyo, where they signed on and they said, yeah, we'll reach peak carbon in 2030. So they signed that a few years ago. So they said, yeah, we're going to have 10 years. We're going to do whatever we want before we adhere to any sort of international standard. And that was considered progress. So I think there's a lot of frustration over that. To underscore what you were saying about offloading some of this core power plant assets, utilities have this base load. And to be able to serve that base load has always been core to their mission, until in some cases recently, where there's just a completely different perspective on that. And I think it's catching up with some of the utilities now, and they're rethinking some of this. Thus, we see Palisades in Michigan being restarted, a large nuclear power plant. We see what I mentioned, TVA committing to Here in California, Diablo Canyon's life was extended for at least 5 years because, as I like to say, someone finally did the math. So that's of great concern. Let me take this, maybe turn the page on this part of the discussion just a little bit, because we've been talking specifically about where utilities sit in a lot of this. But of course, every utility is beholden to some sort of regulatory body. If you're a large investor-owned utility, it's your state public utilities commission, as well as some federal regulations. If you're a municipal, you probably have either a city council or a utility board. If you are a co-op, you have your co-op board. So everyone is beholden to some sort of regulatory body. The regulatory bodies are driving a lot of this. I've seen this firsthand in some of the consulting work I'm doing. Similarly, if you were with those regulators and they're pushing for this 2030, 2040, maybe 2050 energy transition, I've heard you talk about a 70 to 80 year build out. Let's give it decades, not years. How would you convince them, or what's a few key points you would share with a regulator saying, we get it, the energy transition is and can be a good thing, but maybe you might want to rethink it, and here's some thoughts around that. So what should a utility regulator be looking at in terms of what this energy transition looks like, so as not to create these massive swings in reliability and this crisis in rates?
Okay, all of this is done by people who are essentially politicians. Nobody's talking to the engineers. Can you please talk to the engineers? Cost is one thing, but technical feasibility and, worst case scenarios and stress testing of, these systems that they want to put in place. This is what the engineers do. And they're totally left out of the dialogue. Okay. So until people, these politicians, regulators start talking to the engineers, they're not going to come up with anything that is technologically or economically feasible, not to mention, politically sensible. So, it's just, you need to bring the engineers into the dialogue.
Right. And I've had the opportunity, and I've talked about this, I think, on one of the previous episodes, where in a lot of my market research, and I do some consulting, I've been in the room where you have some of the engineers, and you have maybe at one particular example, we had a dozen different utilities, a few different representatives from each utility in the room. And, one guy finally sheepishly kind of raised his hand and said, this is an energy transition, and we need to convince our regulatory body, who shall remain nameless, that gas is a good thing. Gas is a positive part of our transition. It's going to ensure reliability. It's relatively clean. It's inexpensive. And our board just doesn't want to hear it. So I think the regulators, which to your point are very political, I think there has to be, a wake-up call, or they need to start thinking about it differently. So I think I'm with you there. One thing that we've kind of talked around but haven't hit squarely so far is around what I would call climate adaptation versus climate mitigation. In other words, to your point early in our discussion today, you brought up, there is some rising temperature, there is some rising sea level, but to paraphrase you, it's not catastrophic. It is manageable. And by the way, there's some upside to some of this. So what are some thoughts around climate adaptation versus climate mitigation, and how could that be part of a strategy for dealing with climate change?
Okay, well, first you need to understand that climate mitigation, even if we're successful at, getting to net zero by 2050 or something like that, we probably wouldn't notice any change to the climate until the 22nd century. CO2 is not this control knob on climate. There's very long time scales in the oceans and the ice sheets. We're not going to turn this around on a dime. We're not going to get rid of extreme weather events. Sea level is going to continue to rise for several centuries, probably. So we need to get over the idea that we're somehow fixing the climate or improving it, for our lifetimes or even our grandchildren's lifetimes. It would be barely noticeable. That said, we do have vulnerabilities to extreme weather events, climate events, droughts, and, sea level rise. So let's deal with those. All of these problems are by definition local. So if you have a local problem, it's very easy. It's a lot easier to come up with feasible solutions and get buy-in of everybody to secure their common interest. if it's some infrastructure or investing in a warning system or, whatever it might be, it's a lot easier to get buy-in rather than these top-down big global mandates, like net zero or something like that. So, once you break this down into human-sized problems, the solutions are, fairly obvious, and, people can generally agree upon all this. So, I think that's where the focus needs to turn is to reducing our vulnerability, increasing our resilience is part of it, but this requires economic development and money. Okay, so, in the US, we do have plenty of money. The developing countries, they are restricted by money. And unfortunately, all the development aid for almost the last 2 decades has been tied to green energy and climate mitigation. So, the development in Africa and other places has been all but stalled for decades now because of the climate change agenda. I mean, they can't get a loan to build a coal burner or a gas burner, even though they have plenty of coal and gas resources, because nobody will lend them the money because it would increase, CO2 emissions. In the meantime, Europe and Asia are very happy to buy their gas and coal and import it into their countries and then burn it and produce CO2 emissions. It's just, I mean, that's the most reprehensible thing going on in the world right now, in my opinion, is how they're just, raping the African continent and won't support their development. I mean, it's a very bad thing. So, I'm all in favor of adaptation and strategies to reduce our vulnerability. There's many different strategies for many different types of problems, that are relevant in different geographical locations. But, this is about local communities or individual countries working to understand their problems and secure their common interests to improve the situation. So, I mean, this is a much more sensible way to go. And the other thing is about climate change gives you an out, so a dam breaks or there's a big flooding or whatever, and people throw up their hand and say, climate change, and act, we can't do anything about it until we get rid of fossil fuels. Well, that's a big cop-out. It's probably poor governance, poor land use, poor management, poor infrastructure. It's really a governance failure, when you have, rather than blaming it on climate change. So it's a big cop-out for politicians just to blame everything that goes wrong on climate change.
Yeah, it certainly does seem like that. And when we talk about adaptation versus mitigation, I think at least part of what you're getting at is I hear you describe it and you talk about strategies, and it should be more localized or best at a national level, depending on the country. I always think it comes down to what are you going to build, where are you going to build it, how are you going to build it? A lot of the infrastructure, be it homes, be it neighborhoods, be it industrial centers. You look at areas like Florida where they've learned and they're building homes with steel frames instead of wood frames, and they know they can withstand 120 mile an hour winds and things of that nature. So I think there are examples out there where that is happening, and I think that's, of course, a good thing. You've touched on some of this, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. And as we wind down, I had a couple questions for you. One is, if you could just share maybe one or two climate myths or truths that maybe are not part of the mainstream discussion right now, that would maybe help frame where some people may not have as much information as you do. What are some of those myths or truths that people should be a little bit more aware of? Like I say, you've said some of these already, so maybe you want to recap some of those, but what do you think you could share with our audience about that?
Well, I think most people are frightened of extreme weather events, hurricanes, floods, heat waves, getting worse because of CO2 emissions. But, even the UN climate assessment reports don't see a signal of worsening extreme weather events, other than heat waves. But the part they don't tell you is that the cold outbreaks are less in a warming climate, and the mortality for cold events is an order of magnitude higher than for heat events. And this is globally, and this is something that's been known for decades. So with a warming climate, we're overall reducing our mortality to heat extremes. So this idea, fossil-fueled warming, is somehow dangerous, particularly because of extreme weather events, is just really, really not supported by the observations or even the UN climate assessments. I think that's the main message. And the other thing is that carbon dioxide is not a control knob on the climate. There's a whole lot of natural climate variability that goes on. And there's a lot of feedbacks in the systems. And, we don't really have a good understanding on how the planet digests carbon. So, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and thinking that we have a predictive capability for how the climate of the 21st century will play out is, we simply do not. Beyond, all other things being equal, it'll probably continue to warm. But all other things are never equal, and we certainly don't have any confidence in our ability to predict the magnitude of the warming. So we just need to accept that. And, climate change is an ongoing predicament, and we need to get on with it and figure out how to reduce our vulnerability.
There's been a few things in the news within the last few weeks that I want to share with you that I think are interesting turns of events in terms of, I think it would be overstating it to say that, the dominoes are starting to fall in terms of the climate catastrophe posture. But I think some of these things are significant. And, I'm living this world in utilities, practically 24/7 for the last 35 years. So I'm seeing this shift, sometimes in very tangible ways, otherwise just anecdotally or what people will tell me off the record. But let me give you a couple examples. One is about 2 weeks ago, Bill Gates made a statement. I'm just going to read the statement because it speaks for itself. I don't want to misquote him. Although climate change will have serious consequences, particularly for people in the poorest countries, it will not lead to humanity's demise. People will be able to live and thrive in most places on Earth for the foreseeable future. Emissions projections have gone down, and with the right policies and investments, innovation will allow us to drive emissions down much further. Unfortunately, the doomsday outlook is causing much of the climate community to focus too much on near-term emissions goals, and it's diverting resources from the most effective things we should be doing to improve life in a warming world. Boy, sounds like he's been listening to you when he wrote that, and that to me is very encouraging. Now, similarly, a few weeks before that, the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is the utilities regulator for the state of Arizona, they basically dropped their mandatory statewide climate goals. So I think that they gave different rationales for doing it, but one was that they felt the utilities were making enough progress on their own. So that was one rationale for not pursuing that anymore. Around the same time, and I don't think this is coincidental, Arizona Public Service, the largest public utility in Arizona, is shifting its clean energy goals, was how it was stated in a press release. So instead of 100% clean energy pledge, their target now has also been dropped. So the 100% was 2050, 45% for 2030. Those have both been dropped. So there's a significant policy reversal. And part of this is driven by what we've talked about is data center growth. So are you seeing and hearing similar thoughts, similar action where people are rethinking this a little bit? And just let me preface that your answer just a little bit with, again, I can think of two utilities off the top of my head that have 100% renewable or clean goal by 2030. Here in California, of course, our state PUC has some very aggressive goals for all the investor-owned utilities, and most of the municipals follow suit. So, I see this, someone like Bill Gates, who certainly has a platform. I see a pretty large and high growth state like Arizona saying, hold on, guys, we got to rethink this. Do you think we're going to start to see other PUCs and utilities rethinking this? Personally, I do. I don't see how they can't, given that their mission is safe, reliable, affordable energy delivery, and they're putting that at great risk.
Okay, a couple things. I think we reached peak craziness in the climate stuff 2015, with the Paris Climate Agreement, and that was sustained for 5 years. And then when COVID struck, people had something much bigger to worry about. That seemed like a real potential, existential threat. And so the climate argument, took back seat. And then, people just got, sort of climate fatigue. They've been waiting for all these catastrophes and they weren't really happening. And people were saying, it was the whole issue was losing salience. And then when President Trump was elected on his second term, and one of the first things he did was withdraw from the Paris Agreement, people were saying, yeah, okay, yeah, finally, we have an official stamp here to sort of put this on the back burner a bit. So I think the combination of COVID and Trump's election sort of stimulated this to happen. With regards to Bill Gates, the quotation that you provided, I love what he said. I agree with him. The problem with Bill Gates' essay is the solutions he's putting forward. He's trying to feed poison to cows to eliminate their methane emissions, pushing for artificial meat, trying to do solar radiation engineering, all sorts of these technological fixes, which I regard as absolutely harmful. So, so part of Bill Gates's essay, in my opinion, is good. The part that you read, I thought was right. But if you go deeper into the essay and read his technological fixes, most of them are pretty scary. So, it's not entirely a benefit. But, this gives people, a signal. The state of New York is an interesting example because, they were right up there with California in terms of being really extreme. And I was, they were trying to get fully wind and solar plus a little bit of hydropower that they import from Canada. And I was on a committee with the NYSERC or whatever, something like that, a year ago to look at, how do we do this in terms of, wind and solar. And, my part was to show, well, what can happen? How long can you go without wind and not much solar? And, what are you going to do then? My role was, to provide some weather scenarios, but, the engineers can, how do we do this? And then finally, within the last few months, the government of New York, admitted that we can't do this. So, once they talked to the engineers, it's too expensive. We can't do it. Okay, well, thank you very much. But, you could have talked to the engineers before you started closing down all your nuclear power plants and building out all this wind and solar. So people are just starting to understand the economic reality of the situation. And, people still, well, we need cleaner energy, but, cleaner energy in terms of real pollution, like particulates and, air and water pollution. I'm all in favor of that. But, CO2, that's, to me, that is near the bottom of the list of things that we should be worrying about in terms of, designing our 21st century energy infrastructure. Let's make it clean if we can, but CO2 emissions should not be the number one priority as it has been.
Right. And we're at or near that point where folks are starting to see the impacts of rates and reliability. And I think that's ultimately going to play out because the vast majority of their customers, that's what they want. They want reliability and affordability. Clean is great, but not at the expense of those two pillars. So this has been great. I'm just going to wrap up by saying thank you. I'll encourage our viewers and listeners today to check out your book, Climate, Uncertainty, and Risk. You generously shared a copy with me. I've read parts of it. I can't say I've committed to reading all of it because it's a thick read, but there's some good stuff in there, and I think it'll open a lot of eyes. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll look forward to running into you again sometime soon, and thank you to all of you for joining the Watt and Why podcast. We'll hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.